In 1923, an American archaeologist named Herbert Winlock was excavating at the base of the cliffs at Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile across from the ancient city of Thebes, modern Luxor, when his team broke through into a tomb that no one had expected to find. It was not a royal burial. There was no gold. There were no canopic jars, no painted coffins, no offerings of food and wine for the afterlife. What Winlock found instead was a mass grave. 60 bodies, laid side by side in the dark, wrapped in linen that had gone brown with age. They were men, young men, most of them, and they had died violently. Arrow wounds, crushing blows to the skull, vulture marks on the exposed flesh, which told Winlock something terrible. These men had lain unburied on a battlefield long enough for the scavengers to find them before someone, a king, an army, a grieving nation, had gathered the remains and placed them here, in a tomb cut into the rock at the foot of a temple that would not be completed for years. The tomb is known today as the Tomb of the Warriors, and the temple above it belongs to a pharaoh whose name most people have never heard, but whose achievement may be the single most important political act in the history of ancient Egypt. His name was Mentuhotep II, and he did something that the ancient Egyptians themselves considered almost miraculous. He took a broken civilization, a kingdom that had been shattered for nearly 140 years, divided into warring factions, starved by famine, humiliated by the collapse of its oldest institutions, and he put it back together. He reunified Egypt. He ended the civil war. He rebuilt the temples. He restored the administration. He launched the era that Egyptologists call the Middle Kingdom, a period of cultural, literary, and architectural achievement that many scholars consider the high point of Egyptian civilization. But he did it with blood. The 60 soldiers in Winlock's tomb are the proof. They died in the war that made reunification possible. A war fought not against foreign invaders, but against other Egyptians, in a civil conflict that pitted the rulers of Thebes in the south against the rulers of Herakleopolis in the north. The arrows that killed those young men were Egyptian arrows. The wounds were inflicted by Egyptian weapons, and the king who ordered them into battle, the king who then honored them with burial near his own eternal resting place, understood that the price of healing a civilization is sometimes measured in bodies. How does a civilization come back from the dead? That is the question at the center of this story. We spend a great deal of time in documentaries, in books, in late-night conversations, talking about how civilizations fall, the collapse of Rome, the disappearance of the Maya, the silence that swallowed the Indus Valley. These stories are dramatic, haunting, and endlessly fascinating. But there is another story that is told far less often, and it is, in many ways, more important. The story of what happens after the collapse. The story of how a shattered people find the will to rebuild. Because most civilizations that collapse do not simply vanish. They fragment, they suffer, they lose knowledge and population and confidence. And then, sometimes, someone emerges from the wreckage with a vision of what the civilization could become again. Not what it was, what it could be. Mentuhotep II was that someone for Egypt, and his story is not a simple tale of military triumph. It is a story about the relationship between violence and healing, between ambition and grief, between the desire to restore the past and the necessity of creating something new. It is a story about what it actually takes, not in theory, not in principle, but in practice, in blood and stone and administrative reform, to reassemble a civilization that has broken into pieces. It is a story about the cost of renewal, a cost that is always higher than anyone imagines at the beginning, and that leaves scars on the body of the civilization that endure long after the celebrations of victory have faded. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what Egypt looked like after the Old Kingdom fell, a landscape of competing warlords, local strongmen, and desperate populations clinging to the memory of a greatness they could no longer sustain. You are going to understand how one family, in the provincial city of Thebes, rose from obscurity to challenge the established order. You are going to understand what the reunification cost, not just in lives, but in the fundamental transformation of what it meant to be Egyptian. And you are going to see, in the story of Mentuhotep II, a pattern that echoes across every civilization that has ever pulled itself back from the edge of oblivion. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. To understand what Mentuhotep II accomplished, you first have to understand the catastrophe he inherited. A catastrophe so complete that it took the Egyptians themselves more than a century to recover from it. The Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, the age of divine kingship, the age when a single pharaoh commanded the resources of an entire civilization with absolute authority, had collapsed around 2180 BC. The reasons for that collapse were multiple and interlocking. A devastating drought caused by the 4.2 kiloyear climate event, which weakened the Nile floods that sustained Egyptian agriculture. The progressive decentralization of political power as provincial governors accumulated wealth and independence at the expense of the royal court, and the extraordinarily long reign of Pepi II, the last significant pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, whose 94-year rule had allowed the institutions of central government to atrophy beyond repair. When Pepi finally died, an old man in a kingdom that had known no other ruler for the span of living memory, the state he had governed simply fell apart. What followed was the First Intermediate Period, a stretch of roughly 140 years that represents one of the darkest and most poorly documented eras in Egyptian history. The phrase intermediate period sounds almost clinical, as if it were merely a pause between acts. It was not a pause, it was a catastrophe. The centralized government that had built the Great Pyramids of Giza, that had maintained a bureaucracy sophisticated enough to organize the labor of tens of thousands, that had projected military and commercial power from Nubia to the Levant, that government ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. In its place arose a patchwork of competing regional powers, each led by local strongmen who had once been provincial governors, nomarchs, serving at the pharaoh's pleasure. Now they served no one but themselves. To grasp the scale of this fragmentation, consider the geography. Egypt is a narrow ribbon of farmland, rarely more than 20 kilometers wide, stretched along the Nile for over 1,000 kilometers. During the Old Kingdom, this ribbon had been governed as a single administrative unit, divided into 42 districts called nomes, each overseen by a nomarch who answered to the pharaoh at Memphis. The system was centralized, hierarchical, and remarkably efficient. Grain was collected from each district, stored in royal granaries, and redistributed according to need. Labor was organized on a national scale for construction and military campaigns. Justice was administered according to royal decrees that applied uniformly across the kingdom. But when the central government collapsed, each nome became, in effect, an independent city-state, governed by its local nomarch, defended by its local militia, fed by its local agricultural surplus, and answerable to no higher authority. Some nomes prospered under capable leaders. Others descended into famine and disorder. The difference between survival and catastrophe depended not on divine intervention or cosmic order, but on the competence of the local strongman, a reality that the old theology of divine kingship had never anticipated and could not accommodate. The texts that survive from this period paint a picture of a society in profound crisis. The Admonitions of Epua, a literary composition that describes conditions of social upheaval, speaks of a world turned upside down, servants becoming masters, the wealthy begging in the streets, the Nile running with blood. The prophecy of Neferti describes a land consumed by civil strife, where brother fights brother, and the bonds of trust that held society together have dissolved entirely. Whether these texts describe actual events or are literary exercises in catastrophic imagination is debated by scholars. The dating of both texts is contested, and some Egyptologists argue they were composed during the Middle Kingdom, as retrospective reflections on the chaos that preceded it, but the archaeological evidence supports their general picture. Settlement patterns shifted dramatically during the First Intermediate Period. Population declined in some regions. Monumental construction virtually ceased. The quality of manufactured goods, pottery, stone vessels, metalwork, deteriorated noticeably. The elaborate tomb art that had characterized the Old Kingdom gave way to simpler, cruder styles in many areas. the economic and administrative infrastructure that had sustained one of the most complex societies in the ancient world had broken down. The inscription of Antifi, a nomarch of the Herakleopolis region in southern Upper Egypt, who lived in the generation after the collapse, provides one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of conditions during the early intermediate period. Antifi describes finding his district in a state of near total breakdown. He writes that all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, that people had resorted to eating their own children. He then describes his own efforts to rescue the situation, opening his granaries, distributing food to the starving, maintaining order through personal authority and force of will. The pharaoh is barely mentioned. Antifi is not governing on behalf of the king. He is governing because the king does not exist in any practical sense. His authority comes not from divine appointment, but from his own competence and his willingness to act when no one else can. This is the world that the first intermediate period created, a world where legitimacy was local, where power was personal, and where survival depended on the ability of individual leaders to provide for their people in the absence of any larger system. But Egypt did not simply dissolve into anarchy. What emerged from the wreckage of the Old Kingdom was something more structured than chaos, but far less stable than a state, a system of competing power centers, each claiming legitimacy, each fighting for dominance, each trying to fill the void left by the collapse of divine kingship. Two of these power centers would prove decisive. In the north, based at the city of Herakleopolis, near the entrance to the Fayum oasis, about 100 kilometers south of modern Cairo, a dynasty of kings established control over Lower Egypt and much of Middle Egypt. These were the rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties, and they claimed the title of Pharaoh with all its traditional authority. They maintained a court, issued decrees, conducted diplomacy, and governed through a network of allied nomarchs who recognized their supremacy, at least in theory. The Herakleopolitan kings represented a kind of partial restoration, an attempt to recreate the centralized state within the territory they controlled. Their inscriptions invoke the old formulas of royal power. Their tombs, though modest by Old Kingdom standards, display the trappings of pharaonic authority. They were trying, within their limited domain, to be what the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had been, and they were not entirely unsuccessful. The north under Herakleopolitan rule appears to have been more stable and better administered than many parts of the fragmented south, at least in the early decades of the intermediate period. In the south, a different power was rising. At Thebes, a city that had been of only modest importance during the Old Kingdom, located deep in Upper Egypt, near the Great Bend of the Nile, a family of local rulers was building something new. The Theban rulers of what Egyptologists call the 11th dynasty began as nomarchs, provincial governors of the 4th nome of Upper Egypt, the Theban nome. They were, in the hierarchy of the Old Kingdom, minor figures, administrators of a single district in the Upper Nile Valley, far from the centers of power at Memphis and Giza. But the collapse of central authority had created an opportunity that these men seized with remarkable skill and determination. With no effective pharaoh to enforce obedience, the Theban nomarchs began to expand their power, first over neighboring districts, then over larger stretches of Upper Egypt, until they controlled enough territory and commanded enough military force to challenge the Northern dynasty for control of the entire country. The first Theban rulers to take the title of king, rather than merely nomarch, were Intef I, Intef II, and Intef III. These men, who ruled in succession during the late 22nd and early 21st centuries BC, transformed Thebes from a provincial backwater into the capital of a southern kingdom. Their tombs, a series of rock-cut chapels at the site known as El Tarif, on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, are modest by the standards of the Old Kingdom pyramid builders, but impressive for their era. They are fronted by large courtyard areas, known as saf tombs, saf meaning row in Arabic, referring to the rows of pillared openings that define their facades. These tombs were not designed to impress through sheer mass, as the pyramids had been. They were designed to express authority through architectural dignity and permanence, a new aesthetic for a new kind of kingship. Intef II, in particular, was a formidable figure. His reign lasted approximately 50 years, during which he pushed the boundary of Theban control steadily northward, conquering nome after nome from the Herakleopolitan sphere of influence. A remarkable stela, a carved stone monument, erected by Intef II, describes his military campaigns and his territorial gains in language that makes clear the scale of his ambition. He was not merely defending his home territory, he was building a kingdom. The stela also reveals something of the man himself, or at least the image he wished to project. It describes him hunting in the desert with his beloved dogs, whose names, Bekai, Abaka, Pehetsu, Tekru, and one whose name is partially lost, are carefully inscribed alongside their masters' titles and achievements. It is a strikingly personal detail in a genre that is usually relentlessly formal. The king who would reshape the political landscape of Egypt also loved his dogs enough to immortalize them in stone. These small details matter. They remind us that the people who built and destroyed and rebuilt the ancient world were not abstractions. They were human beings with attachments, preferences, and personalities that their official inscriptions only occasionally reveal. But the Intefs, for all their military success, did not complete the reunification. They extended Theban power across much of Upper Egypt, but the north, the rich agricultural lands of the Delta, the ancient capital of Memphis, the trade routes that connected Egypt to the Levant, remained under Herakleopolitan control. The two kingdoms existed in a state of intermittent warfare and uneasy coexistence, each claiming to be the legitimate ruler of all Egypt, neither able to deliver the decisive blow that would end the stalemate. The border zone between the two kingdoms, roughly the region around Abydos and Thinis in Middle Egypt, was as a landscape of chronic conflict. Raids, skirmishes, and brief campaigns characterized the relationship between North and South for decades. The local population, caught between the two powers, endured the worst of it. The tomb inscriptions of officials in the border region describe a world of perpetual insecurity. Crops destroyed, villages burned, livestock stolen, families displaced. One official, a man named Jari, who served the Theban king, describes his role in defending the southern border against northern incursions and in launching counterattacks into enemy territory. His inscription is matter-of-fact about the violence. It is simply part of his job, the daily reality of service on a militarized frontier, but the cumulative effect of decades of such conflict on the civilian population can only be imagined. For the people who lived in the border nomes, the first intermediate period was not an abstract political crisis. It was a grinding generational experience of war, deprivation, and uncertainty, a world where the next raid might come at any time, and where the question of which king one served could be a matter of life and death. Another inscription, from a man named Keti, who served as nomarch of the Ashut region, firmly in the Herakleopolitan sphere, provides the northern perspective on the conflict. Heti describes fortifying his district against Theban attacks, organizing his militia, and maintaining order in a region that was constantly threatened by southern incursions. He boasts of his loyalty to the Herakleopolitan king, his military prowess, and his ability to protect his people. His tomb, cut into the cliffs at Asyut, is decorated with scenes of military life, soldiers marching, ships sailing, weapons being manufactured, that reflect the martial culture of a border district that had been at war for as long as anyone could remember. When Mentuhotep's forces finally swept through the region, Keti's world, and the world of every Herakleopolitan loyalist in Middle Egypt, came to an abrupt end. Their monuments were defaced, their inscriptions were left to weather and decay. The victors wrote the history, and the losers became footnotes. It was into this divided world, a world of two Egypts, two courts, two competing claims to divine authority, and a border zone scarred by generations of war, that Mentuhotep II was born. His birth name was Mentuhotep, meaning the god Montu is satisfied, and the choice of name is significant. Montu was the falcon-headed war god of the Theban region, a deity associated with military valor and aggressive kingship. To name a royal son after Montu was to announce an intention. This was not a child destined for the priesthood or the scribal schools. This was a child born for war. Mentuhotep II came to the throne around 2061 BC, though the exact date, like so many dates in Egyptian history, is debated. He was the son of Intef III, the last of the Intef kings, and he inherited a kingdom that was powerful but incomplete. The Theban realm controlled Upper Egypt from the first cataract at Aswan to the region around Abydos, roughly in the middle of the country. But everything north of that, Memphis, the Delta, the great trade routes, belonged to the enemy, and the enemy was not weak. The Herakleopolitan kings of the 10th dynasty maintained their own army, their own bureaucracy, their own network of loyal nomarchs. They had controlled the north for generations. They were entrenched. Dislodging them would require not just military skill, but sustained political will. The willingness to fight a long war, to absorb setbacks, to hold territory once taken, and to convince the population of the conquered regions that Theban rule was preferable to what they had known. The early years of Mentuhotep's reign are poorly documented, a frustrating gap in the record that reflects the limited sources available for this period. What we know comes primarily from archaeological evidence, building inscriptions, tomb biographies of officials who served him, and the physical remains of his construction projects. The picture that emerges is of a king who spent the first decade or more of his reign consolidating Theban power in the south, securing his borders, building his army, and preparing for the campaign that would define his legacy. One of the most telling pieces of evidence for Mentuhotep's early reign comes from his Horus name, the first of the 5 royal names that every Egyptian pharaoh bore. Egyptian kings could change their Horus name to reflect new circumstances or achievements, and Mentuhotep changed his 3 times during the course of his reign, a fact that is virtually unique in Egyptian history, and that tells us more about the trajectory of his rule than any other single piece of evidence. His first Horus name was Sankibtawi, he who makes the heart of the 2 lands live. This is a name of aspiration, not achievement. It declares an intention to reunify Egypt, but acknowledges that the reunification has not yet occurred. The 2 lands are mentioned, but they are sick. Their heart needs to be made to live again. His second Horus name, adopted later, was Netrihejet. Divine is the white crown, a reference to the crown of Upper Egypt that emphasized his southern identity and his claim to rule from Thebes. And his final Horus name, adopted after the reunification was complete, was Semetui, he who unifies the 2 lands. The progression tells the story in miniature: aspiration, assertion, accomplishment. 3 names for 3 phases of a reign that transformed Egypt. The turning point came in approximately the 14th year of Mentuhotep's reign, though again, the chronology is uncertain, and some scholars place the decisive conflict earlier or later. Archaeological evidence suggests that a major military confrontation occurred in the region around Abydos and Thinis, the traditional boundary zone between the 2 kingdoms. The details of the battle, or battles, are lost to us. No campaign narrative survives from Mentuhotep's own records, and the Herakleopolitan perspective has been almost entirely erased from history by the victors. What we have instead are the consequences. The tomb of the 60 slain warriors at Deir el-Bahari, the disappearance of the Herakleopolitan dynasty from the historical record, and the sudden expansion of Theban administrative authority across the entire Nile Valley. Herbert Winlock, the American archaeologist who discovered the Tomb of the Warriors in 1923, described the scene with the controlled precision of a scientist and the barely contained emotion of a man confronting the reality of ancient violence. The bodies had been wrapped in linen but not mummified, a sign that they had been buried hastily, probably in the field, before a more permanent interment near the king's temple. Many of the skulls showed evidence of blunt force trauma, massive fractures inflicted by maces or axes, the weapons of close combat. Several bodies still had ebony-tipped arrows embedded in them, arrows fired from a distance before the lines closed. The wounds were concentrated on the left side of the body, suggesting that the men had been facing their attackers and had been struck while advancing, their left sides exposed as they held their shields. These were not victims of a massacre. They were soldiers who had died fighting, and they had been honoured for it, buried with care, in a location of prestige, close to the king they had served, and the temple that would be his eternal monument. Winlock later wrote that the discovery was one of the most moving he had experienced in decades of Egyptian archaeology. These were not kings or priests or scribes. They were ordinary men, farmers probably, conscripted into the army of a Theban king who had promised them that the war would reunify their country. They had believed him. They had marched north into the border zone where their fathers and grandfathers had fought before them, and they had died for that belief on a battlefield somewhere in Middle Egypt under a sun that has not changed in 4,000 years. Their names are lost, their individual stories are unrecoverable. But their bones tell us something that no royal inscription can, that the reunification of Egypt was not a political abstraction. It was paid for in blood. The kingdom was not inherited. It was earned, with arrow wounds and skull fractures, and the kind of sacrifice that official history tends to gloss over in favour of the triumphs of kings. The fall of Herakleopolis, the moment when the northern capital was finally captured or surrendered, is one of the great lacunae in Egyptian history. We do not know exactly when it happened, how it happened, or what became of the last Herakleopolitan king. The northern dynasty simply vanishes from the record, replaced by Theban officials and Theban administrative practices. Some scholars believe there was a negotiated surrender, a deal in which the northern elites accepted Theban sovereignty in exchange for retaining some of their local power. Others believe there was a siege and a sack, a violent end to a dynasty that had ruled the north for over a century. The instruction addressed to King Merikare, a text attributed to a Herakleopolitan king and addressed to his son, contains a passage that may refer to the final conflict. It warns the young king to be vigilant, to maintain his army, to remember that the south is always watching. Whether this is genuine political advice from a doomed king to his heir, or a later literary construction, is debated by scholars with equal passion on both sides. But the warning was prescient. The south was watching, and when it moved with devastating force. By roughly 2040 BC, approximately 20 years into his reign, Mentuhotep II had achieved what no Egyptian ruler had accomplished in over a century. He controlled the entire Nile Valley, from the cataracts in the south to the delta in the north. He held Memphis, the ancient capital, the city of the pyramid builders, symbolic heart of unified Egypt. He commanded the trade routes to the Levant and the mining expeditions to the Sinai. He received tribute from Nubia, and he began to build, not just monuments, but a new version of the Egyptian state. The monument that best embodies Mentuhotep's vision is his mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. This building, or rather, what remains of it, is one of the most innovative architectural achievements in Egyptian history. Unlike the pyramids of the Old Kingdom, which were geometric abstractions rising from the desert floor, Mentuhotep's temple was built into the landscape itself. It was set against the dramatic limestone cliffs of the Theban necropolis, its terraced levels rising from a valley floor planted with trees, sycamores and tamarisks, in a deliberate evocation of a sacred garden. Archaeologists found the stumps of these trees still in their original planting pits, preserved by the dry desert air for 4 millennia. The temple incorporated a central structure that may have been a small pyramid or a flat-topped mastaba. The archaeological evidence is ambiguous, and the superstructure has not survived. Surrounded by a colonnaded hall and preceded by a long causeway that led from the edge of the cultivated land to the temple entrance. The effect was theatrical in the best sense. A building that used the natural landscape as part of its design, creating a visual experience of ascending from the valley of the living to the realm of the dead. The temple was also a political statement. By building at Deir el-Bahari, a site that had no previous royal associations, Mentuhotep was declaring his independence from the Old Kingdom tradition. He was not building at Saqqara or Giza, where his predecessors had erected their monuments. He was building at Thebes, his hometown, the city from which his family had launched the reunification. The message was unmistakable. The new Egypt would be centered not on Memphis but on Thebes. The age of the pyramid builders was over. A new age had begun. The Egyptologist Dieter Arnold, who conducted the most thorough modern study of Mentuhotep's temple, described it as a revolutionary building one that broke decisively with Old Kingdom architectural conventions while maintaining continuity with the deeper traditions of Egyptian religion and funerary practice. Arnold noted that the terraced design, which would later inspire the far more famous Temple of Hatshepsut, built nearby 500 years later, represented a new conception of the relationship between the king and the landscape, a conception that saw the natural world not as something to be dominated by massive geometric forms, but as something to be incorporated, harmonized, made part of the sacred whole. It was architecture as reconciliation, an attempt to bring together the old and the new, the divine and the natural, the living and the dead. But the temple also contained the bodies of the warriors who had made it all possible. The tomb of the warriors, located at the base of the cliffs near the temple, was not an accident of placement. It was a deliberate choice, a statement that the men who had died for reunification deserved to spend eternity near the king they had served. In death, as in life, they would remain within his orbit, and anyone who visited the temple, any priest, any pilgrim, any future pharaoh, would know that the splendor above was built on the sacrifice below. The reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II was not simply a military achievement. It was a problem of staggering complexity, a problem that required not just the defeat of a rival dynasty, but the reconstruction of an entire system of governance, belief, and identity that had been shattered for over a century. And to understand the magnitude of that problem, we need to look more closely at what the First Intermediate Period had actually done to Egypt, not just politically, but psychologically, culturally, and spiritually. When the Old Kingdom collapsed, Egypt did not merely lose a government, it lost a worldview. The entire theological and political structure of the Old Kingdom had been built on a single proposition: that the pharaoh was divine, that his authority was absolute, and that the cosmic order, Ma'at, depended on his person. When the pharaoh could no longer feed his people, when the Nile floods failed and the centralized grain redistribution system broke down, when provincial governors began to act as independent rulers, the proposition collapsed along with the institutions that embodied it. The result was not just political fragmentation, it was an existential crisis. The Egyptians had to confront the possibility that the foundational beliefs of their civilization, beliefs that had sustained them for 800 years, were wrong, that the pharaoh was not divine, that Ma'at was not guaranteed, that the universe was not, in fact, ordered in the way they had always believed. The literature of the First Intermediate Period bears witness to this crisis with a rawness that is still startling 4,000 years later. The Dialogue of a Man with His Soul, one of the most profound texts from this era, presents a man so disillusioned with the world that he contemplates ending his own life. He describes a society where loyalty has vanished, where friends betray each other, where the dead are envied, because at least they are at peace. The Admonitions of Ipua describes a world in which the social order has been inverted. The poor have become rich, the rich have become beggars, and the institutions that once maintained order have become instruments of chaos. These are not detached literary exercises. They are the voices of a civilization working through trauma, trying to process the unpossessable fact that everything it had believed in had failed. But the First Intermediate Period was not merely a time of despair. It was also, paradoxically, a time of profound cultural creativity. Freed from the rigid conventions of the Old Kingdom, the standardized tomb art, the formulaic inscriptions, the centralized control of artistic production, the provincial workshops of the First Intermediate Period developed new styles, new forms, and new ideas that would shape Egyptian culture for millennia. The coffin texts, collections of spells and prayers inscribed on the interior surfaces of wooden coffins, expanded and democratized the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, making the afterlife accessible not just to kings, but to anyone who could afford a proper burial. This was a revolutionary idea. In the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh was guaranteed eternal life. His officials and courtiers could hope to share in his immortality, but only through proximity to his divine person, by being buried near his pyramid, by serving in his funerary cult. In the First Intermediate Period, the concept of personal salvation, of every individual having a relationship with the gods that did not depend on the pharaoh's mediation, began to take root. The collapse of divine kingship had destroyed a monopoly on immortality, and what replaced it was something more democratic, more personal, and ultimately more resilient. The provincial art of the first intermediate period also reveals a society that was, in many ways, more diverse and more locally rooted than the Old Kingdom had been. Without central artistic standards to enforce, each region developed its own visual vocabulary. The tomb paintings at Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt show scenes of daily life, farming, fishing, wrestling, warfare, rendered with a vitality and individuality that the more formal Old Kingdom art rarely achieved. The figures are more animated, the compositions more dynamic, the colour palettes bolder. Some scholars see in these provincial paintings the beginnings of a new Egyptian aesthetic, one that valued observation and liveliness over the static perfection of the Old Kingdom canon. The biographical inscriptions in provincial tombs became longer, more detailed, and more personal. Officials no longer defined themselves solely through their relationship to the pharaoh. They described their own achievements, how they fed their people during famine, how they maintained order in their districts, how they built canals and settled disputes and defended their borders against raiders. The collapse of central authority had forced local leaders to justify their power in local terms, and the resulting literature is some of the most honest and human-scaled writing in all of Egyptian history. This was the cultural landscape that Mentuhotep II inherited and had to navigate. He could not simply conquer the north and declare victory. He had to persuade a fragmented, traumatized, culturally diverse population that centralized rule, the very system that had failed them a century and a half earlier, was worth trying again. He had to convince the powerful nomarchs of Middle Egypt, who had governed their districts independently for generations, and who had developed strong local identities and loyalties, to surrender their autonomy to a southern king they had never served. He had to rebuild the administrative infrastructure, the tax systems, the grain redistributions, the construction brigades, the scribal schools that had atrophied or disappeared during the intermediate period. And he had to do all of this while managing the expectations of his own Theban power base, which had its own interests, its own ambitions, and its own vision of what a reunified Egypt should look like. The numbers are striking when you consider the scope of the task. Egypt's population during the first intermediate period had likely declined from the Old Kingdom peak of roughly 1.5 million to perhaps 1 million or fewer, reduced by famine, disease, conflict, and the general breakdown of the agricultural and distribution systems that had sustained the kingdom. The Nile Valley contained dozens of semi-independent districts, each with its own governor, its own militia, its own economic system, and its own entrenched interests. The scribal schools that had trained the Old Kingdom bureaucracy, the institutional memory of the state, had been disrupted or relocated. The diplomatic networks that had connected Egypt to the wider Mediterranean world had frayed. Rebuilding all of this from a single southern city required not just military force, but an organizational genius that the sources barely allow us to glimpse. The challenge was not unlike the challenge faced by any leader who has tried to rebuild a state after civil war. The military victory is only the beginning. The harder work, the work that takes decades, not campaigns, is the work of reconstruction. And reconstruction, in the Egyptian context, meant something more than rebuilding temples and reopening trade routes. It meant rebuilding the shared narrative, the common story that binds a civilization together and gives its members a reason to cooperate, to sacrifice, to trust each other. The Old Kingdom's narrative had been built on the divinity of the pharaoh and the permanence of Mat. That narrative had failed. Mentuhotep needed a new one. Or rather, he needed a revised version of the old one, adapted to the realities of a post-collapse world. The evidence suggests that he found it, not by rejecting the Old Kingdom tradition entirely, but by adapting it with considerable subtlety. Mentuhotep presented himself as the restorer of Mat, the king who had brought order out of chaos, who had reunified the two lands, who had returned Egypt to its proper state. His inscriptions use language that deliberately echoes the Old Kingdom. invoking the same gods, the same formulas, the same claims of divine authority. But there are differences. Differences that scholars have spent decades analyzing and debating. The tone is less absolute. The claims are more specific. Where an Old Kingdom pharaoh might describe himself as the living embodiment of Horus without qualification, Mentuhotep's inscriptions emphasize his achievements, the wars he fought, the buildings he erected, the justice he administered, the enemies he defeated. He is not simply divine by birth. He is divine because of what he has done. The legitimacy has shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from being to doing, from inherited status to earned authority. This shift would prove enormously important for the Middle Kingdom that followed. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, Mentuhotep's successors, though from a different family, would develop this idea further, creating a model of kingship that was more accountable, more self-aware, and more attuned to the needs of the population than anything the Old Kingdom had produced. The wisdom literature of the Middle Kingdom. Texts like the Instruction of Amenemhat and the Loyalist Instruction grapples openly with the challenges of leadership, the dangers of complacency, and the ever-present possibility of betrayal and failure. These are not the texts of a civilization that believes its king is infallible. They are the texts of a civilization that has learned, through bitter experience, that kings can fail, and that the system must be designed to survive that failure. But before the Middle Kingdom could flourish, Mentuhotep had to deal with the immediate aftermath of reunification. And the immediate aftermath was messy. The nomarchs of Middle Egypt, who had governed independently for generations, did not simply bow to Theban authority because the Herakleopolitan dynasty had fallen. Some of them had been allies of the north and had actively resisted the Theban advance. Others had played both sides, waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing their loyalty. Still others had maintained a studied neutrality, governing their districts as independent fiefdoms with no allegiance to either court. Managing these local elites, rewarding the loyal, neutralizing the dangerous, absorbing the ambivalent, required a political sophistication that the surviving records only hint at. We know that some nomarchies were abolished or consolidated under Mentuhotep's rule. Their territories merged into larger administrative units, governed by officials appointed directly by the Theban court. We know that loyal Theban officials were appointed to key administrative positions in the newly conquered territories, creating a network of crown loyalists who could monitor and manage the transition. We know that building projects were initiated across the country, not just at Thebes but at Abydos, at Dendara, at Elephantine, at Gebeline, at Tod, at Armant, as a way of marking Theban authority on the landscape and providing employment for local populations who might otherwise have been restless and resentful. The temples were not just religious monuments. They were instruments of policy, physical demonstrations that the new regime could provide what the old order had failed to deliver: stability, employment, divine favor, and the visible presence of a functioning state. One of the most important administrative innovations of Mentuhotep's reign was the creation of a new class of royal officials who were personally loyal to the Theban court and who served as the king's eyes and ears in the provinces. These men, whose titles and biographies survive in their tomb inscriptions, were not hereditary nomarchs with deep roots in their districts. They were career administrators, appointed by the crown, transferable between posts, and dependent on the king's favour for their status and wealth. The tomb of an official named Henenu, who served Mentuhotep in a variety of capacities, describes a career of extraordinary range. He led military expeditions, organised construction projects, managed trade missions, and served as a troubleshooter in regions where Theban authority was still uncertain. Men like Henenu were the human infrastructure of the new state, the individuals through whom Mentuhotep's policies were implemented in regions far from Thebes. Their competence and loyalty were as essential to the reunification as any military victory. The military campaigns did not end with reunification. Mentuhotep launched expeditions into Nubia, the lands south of the First Cataract, to reassert Egyptian control over the gold routes and the trade networks that had been disrupted during the intermediate period. These Nubian campaigns were not mere border skirmishes. They were systematic operations designed to re-establish the infrastructure of extraction and trade that had sustained the Old Kingdom's wealth. Egyptian soldiers pushed south along the Nile, establishing or reoccupying garrisons, intimidating local populations, and securing the desert routes along which gold, ebony, incense, and exotic animals had once flowed northward to the royal court. Rock inscriptions in Lower Nubia, carved by expedition leaders, record the presence of Egyptian forces in regions that had been beyond the reach of any pharaoh for over a century. He sent forces into the western desert to deal with Libyan groups that had been raiding the agricultural settlements of the delta, populations that had taken advantage of the political chaos to encroach on Egyptian territory. He dispatched mining expeditions to the Sinai for turquoise and copper, and trading expeditions to the port of Byblos in modern Lebanon for the cedar wood that Egyptian builders prized above all other timber. These campaigns served a dual purpose. They projected Egyptian power outward, signaling to the wider world that the kingdom was once again a force to be reckoned with, and they generated wealth, gold, turquoise, cedar, incense, that could be used to fund the enormous construction projects and administrative reforms that the reunification demanded. An inscription from the Wadi Hammamat, a desert valley that served as the route from the Nile Valley to the Red Sea coast, records a quarrying expedition sent by Mentuhotep in the 39th year of his reign to extract stone for royal construction projects. The expedition comprised several thousand men: soldiers, quarrymen, craftsmen, scribes, water carriers, bakers, organized with the kind of bureaucratic precision that had not been seen in Egypt for over a century. The inscription lists the officials by name, records their titles, and describes the logistics of the operation in meticulous detail. It records how many men were assigned to each task, what provisions were carried, and how the stone was extracted and transported. It is, in its way, as significant as any military victory, because it demonstrates that the administrative machinery of the state was functioning again. The scribes were recording, the officials were organizing, the quarries were producing, the supply chains were working, the system had been rebuilt. The Wadi Hammamat inscription also tells us something about the scale of Mentuhotep's ambitions in his later years. By the 39th year of his reign, he was no longer a young conqueror. He was an aging king, still vigorous enough to command massive state projects, but aware, surely, that the work of reunification was far from complete. The quarrying expedition was part of a broader construction program that included not only his mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, but temples and shrines across the length of Egypt. At Abydos, the ancient religious center sacred to Osiris, god of the dead, Mentuhotep built a chapel that proclaimed his authority over one of the most symbolically important sites in the country. At Dendara, the home of the goddess Hathor, he erected a temple that associated his kingship with the divine feminine. At Elephantine, the granite island at the first cataract that marked Egypt's southern border, he constructed fortifications and administrative buildings that served as the staging point for expeditions into Nubia. Each building was a statement. Each temple was a flag planted in territory that Mentuhotep claimed not just politically but spiritually. The religious dimension of the reunification deserves particular attention, because it reveals the depth of the transformation that Mentuhotep attempted. The Old Kingdom had been centered on the northern gods, on Ptah of Memphis, on Ra of Heliopolis, on the solar theology that identified the pharaoh with the sun. The Theban rulers of the 11th dynasty brought with them a different religious emphasis. Their patron deity was Montu, the war god, but the god who would come to define Theban theology and who would eventually become the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon was Amun. During Mentuhotep's reign, the cult of Amun at Thebes was still relatively modest. The great temple complex at Karnak, that would later become the largest religious structure in the ancient world, was only in its earliest stages. But the foundations were being laid, literally and figuratively, for a religious revolution that would reshape Egyptian civilization over the following millennia. Mentuhotep did not just reunify the political structure of Egypt. He began the process of reorienting its spiritual center from north to south, from Memphis to Thebes, from the solar gods of the Old Kingdom to the Theban gods who would dominate the New Kingdom. This religious reorientation was not without tension. The priests of the old northern cults, the servants of Ptah at Memphis, the solar clergy at Heliopolis, had their own interests, their own traditions, and their own claims to authority. Mentuhotep could not simply abolish them or ignore them. He had to accommodate them, to integrate the northern religious traditions into a new theological framework that acknowledged Theban supremacy while respecting the ancient prestige of the northern gods. The result was a period of religious synthesis that scholars have only begun to understand, as the theological texts from Mentuhotep's reign are fragmentary and difficult to interpret. But the general outline is clear. The reunification of Egypt was accompanied by a reunification of Egyptian religion, a process of merging, harmonizing, and reinterpreting the divine that would produce some of the most sophisticated theological thinking in the ancient world. One aspect of Mentuhotep's reign that is often overlooked in general surveys is the role of royal women in the new state. Several of Mentuhotep's queens and consorts were buried in individual tombs within his mortuary temple complex at Deir el-Bahari, an honor that speaks to their political and ritual importance. The tomb of one queen, named Neferu, was decorated with exquisite relief carvings that are considered among the finest examples of Middle Kingdom art. Another queen, Tem, bore the title King's Mother and may have played a significant role in the succession after Mentuhotep's death. The priestess Kemsit was buried in a painted limestone sarcophagus, whose interior decorations depict scenes of daily life. A woman having her hair dressed, drinking from a cup, sniffing a lotus flower, with a delicacy and intimacy that contrasts sharply with the martial imagery of Mentuhotep's own monuments. These women were not ornamental figures. They were members of a ruling family that understood the political importance of dynastic alliances, religious legitimacy, and the visible display of royal power in all its dimensions, including the feminine. The Egyptologist Wolfram Grajecki, who has studied the social structure of Middle Kingdom Egypt extensively, noted that the transition from the first intermediate period to the Middle Kingdom was marked by a significant expansion of the bureaucratic class, a proliferation of officials, scribes, and administrators whose titles and tomb inscriptions reveal a state apparatus of increasing complexity and reach. This expansion was not accidental, it was deliberate policy. Mentuhotep and his successors understood that the Old Kingdom had fallen, in part because the bureaucracy had atrophied and the provincial administrators had become too independent. The solution was to create a new bureaucracy, larger, more specialized, more directly accountable to the crown, that could manage the affairs of a reunified state without the dangerous accumulation of hereditary power in provincial hands. The Middle Kingdom would become, in many respects, the most efficiently administered period in Egyptian history, a period when the scribal class reached its zenith of influence and when the art of bureaucratic management was elevated to something approaching a philosophy of governance. But here is the problem that haunts every reunification, every reconstruction, every attempt to put a broken civilization back together. The system had been rebuilt, but the cracks remained. The nomarchs of Middle Egypt had been subdued, but their families still held local influence and local memory. The administrative machinery was functioning, but it was staffed by a generation of officials who had grown up during the chaos of the intermediate period, and whose loyalties were shaped by that experience, by local allegiances rather than national ones. The theological framework of divine kingship had been restored, but the literature of the period reveals a society that was no longer quite sure it believed the old story. Something is wrong with our assumptions when we imagine reunification as a clean event, a moment of victory followed by stability. The reality was far messier. The archaeological evidence from the decades following Mentuhotep's conquest of the north shows a country that was still deeply fragmented in its cultural practices, even as it was politically unified. Pottery styles, burial practices, and artistic conventions continued to vary significantly from region to region. The standardization that would become one of the hallmarks of the Middle Kingdom was not achieved overnight. It was a gradual process, decades of deliberate cultural policy, of sending Theban craftsmen and scribes into the provinces, of imposing new artistic standards while incorporating local traditions. The unified Egypt that emerged from this process was not a restoration of the Old Kingdom. It was something new, a synthesis of Theban ambition and provincial diversity that would produce one of the richest cultural periods in Egyptian history. Mentuhotep himself ruled for approximately 51 years, a long reign by any standard, though not as extraordinarily long as the 94 years attributed to Pepi II. He died around 2010 BC, having spent the last 3 decades of his reign in a unified Egypt that he had personally reassembled from the wreckage of the First Intermediate Period. The length of his reign was itself a factor in the stability of the new state. Unlike the Old Kingdom, where the extraordinarily long reign of Pepi had allowed institutions to atrophy, Mentuhotep used his decades in power to build, reform, and consolidate. Every year that he remained on the throne was another year of stability, another year in which the new administrative structures could take root, another year in which the population could grow accustomed to Theban rule and begin to see it as normal rather than novel. But his succession was problematic. He was followed by Mentuhotep III, who reigned for approximately 12 years and appears to have maintained the policies of his predecessor. Construction continued, expeditions were launched, the administration functioned. But Mentuhotep III was followed by Mentuhotep IV, who reigned for only about 7 years before the 11th dynasty came to an end. The circumstances of the dynasty's fall are obscure. There is no record of invasion, revolution, or assassination. The dynasty simply ends, and a new family, the 12th dynasty, founded by a man named Amenemhat I, takes power. Some scholars believe Amenemhat was a vizier who seized the throne in a palace coup. Others believe the transition was more gradual, the result of a power vacuum created by the weakness of the last 11th dynasty rulers. The Prophecy of Neferti, a literary text that purports to predict the rise of a savior king named Ameni from the south, may be a piece of political propaganda written to legitimize Amenemhat's seizure of power by presenting it as divinely ordained. The instruction of Amenemhat, written as if the dead king were speaking to his son from beyond the grave, tells the story in far darker terms. The text describes a king who was attacked in his own bedchamber while he slept, betrayed by the guards who were supposed to protect him. "I had not prepared for it," the dead king says. "I had not expected it. My heart had not imagined the treachery of servants." Whether this text describes real events or is a literary exercise in political instruction is debated, but its existence tells us something crucial about the Middle Kingdom. Even the civilization that Mentuhotep built, even the restored state, with its new bureaucracy and its reformed administration and its carefully managed theology, was not immune to the forces of ambition, betrayal, and political violence that had torn the Old Kingdom apart. The system was better, the institutions were stronger, but the human element, the capacity for treachery, the hunger for power, the fragility of trust remained unchanged. And it gets worse, because the very success of Mentuhotep's reunification created a new vulnerability. By centralizing power in Thebes, by building a new administrative apparatuses around the royal court, by concentrating wealth and authority in the hands of a single ruling family, Mentuhotep had recreated, in a different form, the same structural weakness that had destroyed the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom had fallen because the system was too dependent on a single center of gravity. The Pharaoh was too powerful, and when the Pharaoh could no longer hold the system together, the entire structure collapsed. Mentuhotep's new state was less dependent on the divinity of the king. The Middle Kingdom model of kingship was more pragmatic, more accountable, but it was still centralized. It was still dependent on the competence and authority of a single ruler. And when Mentuhotep's dynasty eventually ended, after his successors proved unable to maintain the unity he had forged, the old centrifugal forces reasserted themselves. The nomarchs began to accumulate power again. The provinces drifted toward independence again, and the cycle that had destroyed the Old Kingdom threatened to repeat itself. The fact that it did not repeat itself, that the Middle Kingdom survived the transition from the 11th to the 12th dynasty, and went on to flourish for another 2 centuries, is a testament not to Mentuhotep alone, but to the institutional reforms that he and his successors implemented. The 12th dynasty pharaoh Senusret III, ruling roughly a century after Mentuhotep, would complete the process of administrative reform by systematically dismantling the nomarchic system, replacing the hereditary provincial governors with appointed officials who reported directly to the crown. This was the structural solution to the structural problem that had destroyed the Old Kingdom. It was also, in a sense, the final vindication of Mentuhotep's vision, a centralized state strong enough to survive the death of any individual ruler, because the system no longer depended on the ruler's personal relationships with provincial elites. It depended on institutions, on procedures, on a bureaucracy that could function regardless of who sat on the throne. But that vindication lay in the future. In Mentuhotep's own time, the problem was more immediate and more personal. He had conquered the north. He had rebuilt the administration. He had launched the military campaigns that would restore Egypt's regional power. But he still governed a society that was deeply scarred by its recent past. A society that remembered famine, remembered civil war, remembered the moment when the cosmic order failed and the world descended into chaos. The people he ruled did not merely need a strong king. They needed a reason to believe that the nightmare was over. They needed proof, not just in words but in stone, in temples, in rituals, in the tangible evidence of a functioning state, that the world made sense again. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The proof that Mentuhotep offered, the temples, the campaigns, the restored trade routes, was real. The reunification was genuine. The Middle Kingdom that he founded was one of the great achievements of ancient civilization. And yet, beneath the surface of that achievement, the old vulnerabilities remained. The dependence on the Nile flood, the tension between central and local authority, the fragility of a system built on the assumption that the future will resemble the past. These vulnerabilities were not eliminated by reunification. They were managed, contained, held in check by the strength of the institutions and the competence of the rulers. But they were always there, waiting, like cracks in a foundation that deepen with every season of frost. And when the Middle Kingdom eventually collapsed, as it did several centuries later, during the Second Intermediate Period, the cracks opened again, and the cycle began once more. Foreign rulers called the Hyksos seized power in the Delta. The country fragmented again into competing kingdoms. The temples fell silent, the trade routes closed, and once again, as had happened after the Old Kingdom's fall, a Theban family rose from the south to drive out the foreign occupiers, reunify the country, and launch a new age of Egyptian civilization. The pattern, collapse, fragmentation, recovery from the south, would repeat itself across Egyptian history with a regularity that suggests something deeper than coincidence, something structural, something inherent in the way the Egyptian state was organized, in the geography of the Nile Valley, in the eternal tension between the center and the periphery that no amount of administrative reform could fully resolve. This is the paradox at the heart of Mentuhotep's achievement. He solved the immediate problem. He reunified the country, rebuilt the institutions, restored the trade routes, re-established divine kingship on a more pragmatic and accountable foundation. His solution worked. For 2 centuries, the Middle Kingdom flourished as one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, but he could not solve the underlying problem, the problem of complexity itself, of systems that grow too intricate to sustain, of institutions that calcify over time, of leaders who age and weaken while the challenges they face only intensify. That problem belongs not to Egypt alone, but to every civilization that has ever existed, and it remains unsolved. The story of Mentuhotep II is, in one sense, a uniquely Egyptian story, shaped by the geography of the Nile, the theology of divine kingship, and the specific political dynamics of a civilization divided between north and south. But in another sense, a deeper and more universal sense, it is a story that has been told again and again across the span of human history. Because civilizations do not only collapse, they also recover. And the pattern of recovery, the way broken societies put themselves back together, the leaders who emerge from the wreckage, the compromises they make, the costs they pay, the new vulnerabilities they create, is as recognizable and as repeated as the pattern of collapse itself. To understand what Mentuhotep accomplished and what it cost, we need to look beyond Egypt to other civilizations that have faced the same crisis. The crisis of reunification after fragmentation, of rebuilding after collapse, of finding new meaning after the old certainties have failed. Because Egypt was not the only civilization to break apart and come back together, and the stories of those other recoveries illuminate, by comparison and by contrast, the nature of Mentuhotep's achievement. Let us begin with China, the civilization that, more than any other, mirrors Egypt's pattern of cyclical collapse and reunification. The Chinese historical tradition recognizes a succession of dynastic cycles that maps almost exactly onto the Egyptian pattern. A unified empire, governed by a strong dynasty, gradually weakens through institutional decay, environmental stress, and the accumulation of power by regional elites, until the dynasty falls and the country fragments into competing kingdoms. A period of chaos and civil war follows, sometimes lasting decades, sometimes centuries, until a new strongman emerges from one of the competing states, defeats his rivals, and reunifies the country under a new dynasty. The cycle then begins again. The most famous of these reunifications, and the one that most closely parallels Mentuhotep's achievement, is the founding of the Han dynasty by Liu Bang in 206 BC. Like Mentuhotep, Liu Bang came from humble origins. He was a minor local official from a peasant family, not a hereditary aristocrat or a member of the old ruling elite, and rose to power through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and the ability to inspire loyalty in men who had nothing to lose. His early career reads like a folk tale, a tax collector turned bandit leader turned revolutionary general, gathering followers not through noble birth, but through personal charisma and a willingness to share the rewards of conquest with those who fought beside him. Like Mentuhotep, he reunified a country that had been torn apart by civil war following the collapse of a powerful centralized state. In this case, the Qin dynasty, which had unified China for the first time in 221 BC, but had collapsed after only 15 years under the weight of its own brutality and overreach. The Qin had built the Great Wall, standardized weights and measures, and unified Chinese writing, but it had done so through forced labor, mass conscription, and a legal code of such harshness that minor offenses could result in mutilation or death. When the Qin fell, the country exploded into civil war, and Liu Bang emerged from the chaos as the last man standing, the man whose combination of pragmatism and ruthlessness proved sufficient to defeat all rivals. Like Mentuhotep, Liu Bang faced the challenge of governing a newly reunified country, whose populations had different loyalties, different customs, and different expectations of government. The former kingdoms of Chu, Qi, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yan, and others, states that had been independent for centuries before the Qin unification, had not forgotten their distinct identities. Local elites who had served these vanished kingdoms still commanded the loyalty of their populations. Imposing a purely centralized government on this patchwork of regional identities was as impractical for Liu Bang as it would have been for Mentuhotep to impose purely Theban rule on the nomarchs of Middle Egypt. And like Mentuhotep, Liu Bang's solution was a pragmatic compromise between the old system and the new. He adopted many of the administrative structures of the fallen Qin dynasty while softening their harshest aspects and accommodating the local power structures that had emerged during the civil war. The parallels extend even to the consequences. The Han dynasty, like the Middle Kingdom, flourished for roughly 4 centuries before collapsing into another period of fragmentation. The Three Kingdoms period and the subsequent centuries of division that would not end until the Sui dynasty reunified China in 589 AD. The structural weaknesses that destroyed the Han, the accumulation of land by wealthy families, the weakening of central authority, the rise of powerful regional warlords who commanded private armies and governed their territories as independent fiefdoms, are virtually identical to the weaknesses that destroyed the Old Kingdom. The provincial governors who accumulated hereditary power at the expense of the Egyptian crown have their precise counterpart in the Chinese warlords, who carved out autonomous domains within the nominally unified Han state. The cycle repeated because the underlying dynamics were the same. A centralized state creates stability and prosperity, but stability and prosperity create the conditions for the accumulation of power by elites who eventually undermine the very system that enabled their rise. But Liu Bang's recovery also illustrates a crucial truth about reunification that Mentuhotep's story confirms. The reunifier cannot simply impose his will on the conquered. He must compromise. Liu Bang, despite his military victories, could not govern China alone. He needed the cooperation of the regional kings and the local elites who had fought alongside him or against him during the Civil War. His solution was a hybrid system, directly administered commanderies in the heartland, governed by appointed officials loyal to the crown, coexisting with semi-autonomous kingdoms on the periphery, governed by Liu Bang's relatives and allies, who were given considerable freedom in exchange for their loyalty. This compromise between centralization and decentralization, between the ideal of unified rule and the practical necessity of accommodating local power, would define the early Han dynasty and would be a source of both its strength and its vulnerability. Mentuhotep faced exactly the same dilemma. He could not abolish the nomarchs overnight. He had to work with them, around them, and through them, gradually shifting the balance of power toward the center while maintaining the fiction of continuity with the old provincial system. The math is striking. China has been unified under a single government for roughly 2/3 of the last 2,200 years. The remaining third has been spent in periods of fragmentation and civil war, periods that the Chinese historical tradition treats as aberrations, as interruptions of the natural order, just as the Egyptians treated their intermediate periods. But the regularity of these interruptions, roughly one major fragmentation every 3 to 5 centuries, suggests that they are not aberrations at all. They are features of the system, predictable consequences of the dynamics of centralized power in a large, geographically diverse territory. The Chinese philosopher Luo Guanzhong, writing in the 14th century AD, opened his great novel, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, with a sentence that captures this cyclical understanding perfectly. The empire, long divided, must unite. Long united, must divide. The Egyptians would have understood this wisdom immediately. It was the story of their own civilization, written in hieroglyphs on the walls of tombs that no Chinese historian would ever see. Now let us turn to a very different example, one that illuminates not the pattern of successful reunification, but the pattern of failed recovery. The Roman Empire in the West collapsed in the late 5th century AD, a process that has been endlessly debated by historians from Gibbon to the present day, and that no single explanation can adequately capture. The military pressure from Germanic peoples along the northern frontier, the economic decline of the western provinces, the political instability of an empire that saw more than 20 emperors in the 5th century alone, many of them murdered, the increasing dependence on Germanic generals who commanded the loyalty of the army more than the emperor did. All of these factors combined to produce a collapse that, while gradual in some regions, was catastrophic in its cumulative effect. What matters for our purposes is what happened after the fall. Unlike Egypt, which reunified under Mentuhotep within a century and a half of the Old Kingdom's collapse, the Western Roman Empire never reunified. The territory that had been governed as a single political unit for centuries fragmented into a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms: the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Vandals in North Africa, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, that never cohered into a unified state. Individual leaders attempted reunification, and their failures are as instructive as Mentuhotep's success. Justinian, the Byzantine emperor ruling from Constantinople in the 6th century, reconquered much of the western Mediterranean through the brilliant generalship of Belisarius and Narses, two of the finest military commanders of late antiquity, whose campaigns remain studied in military academies to this day. Italy was retaken from the Ostrogoths in a series of brutal campaigns that lasted nearly 2 decades. North Africa was reclaimed from the Vandals in a single brilliant campaign that succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Parts of Spain were occupied. For a brief, intoxicating moment, The Mediterranean was once again something approaching a Roman lake, and it seemed as though the empire might be restored, as though Justinian might be to Rome what Mentuhotep had been to Egypt, the leader who reassembled a shattered civilization through sheer force of will and military brilliance. But Justinian's conquests did not last. The wars of reconquest had devastated the very territories they were meant to liberate. Italy in particular was ruined by decades of warfare between Byzantine forces and the Ostrogoths, reduced from the most prosperous region in the western Mediterranean to a depopulated wasteland. Within a generation of Justinian's death, the Lombards invaded Italy, and most of the reconquered territory was lost again. The attempt at restoration had been worse than the original collapse. Charlemagne united much of Western Europe under Frankish rule in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, and on Christmas Day of the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans, a title that explicitly claimed continuity with the fallen empire. But Charlemagne's empire, like Justinian's reconquest, did not outlast its creator. Within a generation of his death, the empire was divided among his grandsons at the Treaty of Verdun in 843, and the political map of Europe that emerged, with a Western Frankish kingdom that would become France, an Eastern Frankish kingdom that would become Germany, and a Middle Kingdom that would be fought over for centuries, bore no resemblance to the unified Roman state that Charlemagne had claimed to restore. The dream of a restored Roman Empire persisted for centuries. The Holy Roman Empire endured in name until 1806, but the reality of reunification was never achieved. Why not? Why did Egypt recover and Rome did not? The question has no simple answer, but several factors stand out. Geography played a crucial role. Egypt is a narrow, linear country, a single river valley that can be traversed from end to end in a few weeks of sailing. The Nile itself serves as both a transportation corridor and a unifying force, a physical connection between north and south that makes political unity natural and fragmentation unstable. Any king who controls the river controls the country. The Roman Empire, by contrast, was a vast Mediterranean civilization spread across 3 continents, connected by sea routes that were vulnerable to piracy and disruption, and by road networks that required constant maintenance by a functioning state. Reunifying Egypt meant conquering a single river valley, roughly 1,000 kilometers long. Reunifying Rome would have meant conquering an area stretching from Scotland to Syria, from Morocco to Mesopotamia, a proposition of an entirely different order of magnitude. Cultural unity also mattered. Egypt, for all its regional diversity during the First Intermediate Period, shared a single language, a single writing system, a single religious tradition, and a single conception of kingship. The Egyptians of Upper Egypt and the Egyptians of Lower Egypt spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and understood themselves as members of the same civilization. Even during the worst of the fragmentation, a Theban and a Herakleopolitan disagreed about who should be pharaoh, not about whether there should be a pharaoh. The Roman Empire, by contrast, encompassed dozens of languages, dozens of religious traditions, and a vast range of cultural identities that had been held together by Roman law, Roman roads, and Roman legions rather than by any deep cultural homogeneity. The peoples of Roman Britain had very little in common with the peoples of Roman Egypt. The shared Romanness that had held the empire together, a combination of law, language, engineering, and military force, proved insufficient to survive the collapse of the state that had maintained it. When the state vanished, the identity vanished with it. But perhaps the most important difference was institutional. Egypt's collapse was a collapse of the central government, but the underlying structures of Egyptian civilization, the agricultural system, the religious tradition, the scribal culture, the basic social organization of the village and the nome, survived the fall of the Old Kingdom largely intact. The First Intermediate Period was politically fragmented, but it was not culturally annihilated. The knowledge needed to run a centralized state, the scribal skills, the administrative procedures, the agricultural expertise, the engineering knowledge, was preserved in the provincial workshops and scribal schools that continued to function throughout the intermediate period. When Mentuhotep reunified the country, he was not building from scratch. He was reassembling components that already existed, fitting them back together in a new configuration, certainly, but working with materials that had survived the catastrophe. The Roman collapse was different. In the West, the collapse was not merely political, but institutional. The Roman administrative apparatus, the tax collection system, the military supply chain, the cursus publicum or imperial postal service, the legal system with its courts and advocates and precedents, did not merely weaken, it disappeared. The skills needed to maintain these systems were lost, as the educated class that had operated them either died, fled to the east, or was absorbed into the new Germanic ruling class, which had its own traditions of governance that bore little resemblance to the Roman model. The libraries that had preserved Roman knowledge were destroyed or neglected. The aqueducts that had provided clean water to Roman cities fell into disrepair and were not fixed because no one remembered how they worked, or, more precisely, because no functioning state existed that could organize and fund the repairs. The collapse was not a disassembly but a dissolution. The components themselves were destroyed, making reassembly impossible. This contrast between disassembly and dissolution, between a collapse that preserves the building blocks and a collapse that destroys them, is one of the most important distinctions in the study of civilizational recovery, and it speaks directly to the nature of Mentuhotep's achievement. He was able to reunify Egypt because Egypt's collapse, for all its devastation, had not destroyed the fundamental ingredients of Egyptian civilization. The river still flowed. The agricultural system still functioned, at least at the local level. The scribes still wrote. The gods were still worshipped. The memory of what Egypt had been, the collective understanding that a unified kingdom was the natural and proper state of affairs, survived in the minds and the texts and the traditions of a people who had never entirely given up on the idea of wholeness. And here is the question that makes this pattern so relevant to our own time. In a world of digital infrastructure, of just-in-time supply chains, of knowledge stored on servers rather than in minds, of skills so specialized that no single person understands more than a fraction of the systems on which we all depend, is our civilization more like Egypt or more like Rome? If our central systems failed, would the building blocks survive for reassembly, or would the dissolution be so complete that no Mentuhotep could put the pieces back together? Let us consider another example, one from the Americas, that adds a different dimension to this question. The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica experienced not one but multiple cycles of collapse and partial recovery between roughly the 3rd and the 16th centuries AD. The classic Maya collapse, the dramatic abandonment of the great cities of the southern lowlands around 900 AD, is one of the most famous episodes of civilizational failure in world history. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palenque, centers of extraordinary artistic, architectural, and intellectual achievement, cities where astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with a precision that modern scientists have verified, where scribes recorded history in one of the most complex writing systems ever devised, where architects built limestone pyramids that still rise above the jungle canopy, were abandoned within the space of roughly a century. The population of the southern lowlands declined catastrophically from an estimated peak of several million to a fraction of that number. Entire regions that had supported dense agricultural populations were depopulated. The causes, as with every collapse in this survey, were multiple and interlocking. Prolonged drought, confirmed by speleothem records from Belizean caves and lake sediment cores from the Yucatan. Environmental degradation, including deforestation and soil exhaustion from centuries of intensive agriculture. Chronic warfare between competing city-states that drained resources and destroyed agricultural infrastructure. Social upheaval, possibly including revolts against the ruling elite, and the fragility of agricultural systems pushed beyond their sustainable limits by a population that had grown too large for the land to support. But the classic Maya collapse was not the end of Maya civilization. It was the end of a particular phase. While the southern lowland cities were being swallowed by jungle, the Maya cities of the northern Yucatan, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, Mayapan, continued to flourish. Maya civilization did not die. It migrated, it transformed. The northern cities developed new architectural styles. The Puc style, with its elaborate geometric facades, new political structures that may have involved a form of shared governance rather than the divine kingship of the classic period, and new trade networks that sustained Maya culture for centuries after the southern collapse. Chichen Itza, in particular, became one of the great cities of the post-classic period, a cosmopolitan center where Maya, Toltec, and other Mesoamerican traditions merged to create something that was neither purely Maya nor purely foreign, but a synthesis that reflected the new realities of the post-classic world. The Great Cenote at Chichen Itza, a natural sinkhole that the Maya used as a sacred site for offerings, has yielded artifacts from across Mesoamerica, evidence of the far-flung trade networks that connected the surviving Maya cities to the wider world. And when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they found not a dead civilization, but a living one. Diminished, certainly, fragmented into competing city-states, weakened by internal conflicts and by the lingering effects of earlier collapses, but alive, speaking Maya languages, building Maya temples, recording Maya history in Maya script, practicing Maya agriculture, worshipping Maya gods, fighting the Spanish with a ferocity and a tactical sophistication that delayed the final conquest of the Yucatan until 1697, nearly 2 centuries after the fall of the Aztec capital, a testament to the resilience of a civilization that had already survived one catastrophic collapse, and had emerged from it with enough strength and coherence to resist conquest by the most powerful military technology of the age. The Maya example complicates the simple narrative of collapse and recovery. It suggests that civilizational death is not a binary event, alive or dead, functioning or collapsed, but a spectrum. A civilization can lose its largest cities, its most impressive monuments, its most complex institutions, and still survive in a reduced form, like a forest fire that destroys the canopy but leaves the root system intact, allowing new growth to emerge from the ashes. The question is not whether collapse happens. It always does, eventually. But whether the civilization preserves enough of its essential character to regenerate. And the answer depends, in every case, on what counts as essential. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom were not essential. Egypt survived without them. The divine kingship of the Old Kingdom was not essential in its original form. Mentuhotep created a revised version that proved more durable. What was essential was the river, the language, the writing system, the memory of unity, the conviction, held by enough people in enough places for long enough, that the broken state could and should be made whole. Now let us look at one more example, perhaps the most sobering of all. That brings us full circle back to the Mediterranean world in which Egypt existed. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed around 1200 BC in a cascade of failures that destroyed or severely damaged every major power in the region. This was not a single event, but a process, a decades-long unraveling that scholars have compared to a series of dominoes falling, each collapse triggering or accelerating the next. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt as the dominant power of the Near East, which had fought Ramesses II to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, which had governed most of modern Turkey and northern Syria from its massive fortified capital at Hattusa, was annihilated. Its cities were burned, its archives were sealed beneath rubble, its people dispersed into the countryside or migrated to new regions, becoming part of the great population movements that the Egyptians called the invasions of the Sea Peoples. The Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, the civilization that had inspired Homer's tales of Troy, of Agamemnon, of the heroes who sailed across the wine-dark sea, were destroyed. The palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos were burned and abandoned, their administrative systems destroyed, their Linear B writing system lost to memory. The great trading cities of the Levant, Ugarit, whose scribes wrote in 7 languages and whose merchants traded with every power in the Mediterranean, Alalak, Hattusa, were burned and never rebuilt. The last message from Ugarit, found in an oven where a scribe had placed it to be fired into permanence, is a desperate plea for help from a city under attack by enemy ships. A plea that was never answered because there was no one left to answer it. Egypt survived, but barely, weakened, diminished, shorn of its Asiatic empire, reduced from a great power to a regional one that would never again achieve the dominance it had enjoyed during the New Kingdom. The recovery from the Bronze Age collapse took centuries. In Greece, the period that followed, the Greek Dark Ages, lasted roughly 400 years, during which the population declined, writing was lost entirely, trade diminished to a trickle, and the artistic and architectural achievements of the Mycenaean period were forgotten. When Greek civilization re-emerged in the archaic period of the 8th and 7th centuries BC, it was a fundamentally different civilization, organized around independent city-states rather than palatial kingdoms, governed by assemblies and councils rather than divine kings, literate in a new alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians rather than the old Linear B script of the Mycenaeans. The recovery, when it came, was not a restoration, it was a reinvention. And the reinvented civilization, the civilization of the Greek polis, of Athenian democracy, of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, of the Parthenon and the Olympic Games, owed its character not to the Mycenaean past it had lost, but to the Dark Age it had survived. The very absence of a palatial tradition, the fact that there was no king to restore, no palace to rebuild, no centralized state to reassemble, forced the Greeks to invent new forms of political organization from scratch. Democracy was not a gift from the Mycenaean past. It was an improvisation born of the centuries when there was no past to return to. And this is perhaps the most important lesson of the comparative analysis. Civilizational recovery is never restoration. It is always transformation. Mentuhotep did not restore the Old Kingdom. He created the Middle Kingdom, a new civilization, built on the foundations of the old but different in structure, in theology, in aesthetics, and in self-understanding. Liu Bang did not restore the Qin dynasty. He created the Han dynasty, which adopted the Qin's administrative structures, while abandoning its totalitarian methods and creating a philosophical framework that valued Confucian benevolence alongside legalist efficiency. The Greek city-states did not restore Mycenaean civilization. They created something entirely new, a civilization that would produce democracy, philosophy, tragedy, history, and some of the most influential ideas in human experience. In every case, the civilization that emerged from the collapse was not a copy of what had come before. It was a response to what had come before, shaped by the memory of failure, tempered by the experience of loss, determined not to repeat the mistakes that had brought the previous order crashing down. The question, then, is not whether civilizations can recover from collapse. They can. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether they can recover as themselves, whether the continuity of identity that connects the recovered civilization to the fallen one is real or merely a comforting fiction. And the answer, based on the evidence of Egypt, China, Greece, and every other civilization that has gone through this cycle, is that the continuity is real but partial. The recovered civilization inherits the language, the religion, the artistic traditions, and the collective memory of the fallen one. But it inherits them in modified form, adapted to new circumstances, reinterpreted in light of new experiences, purged of the elements that failed and enriched by the elements that the collapse itself produced. The first intermediate period produced coffin texts, personal salvation theology, and provincial art that would enrich Egyptian culture for millennia. The Greek Dark Ages produced the oral epic tradition that gave birth to Homer. The period of division following the Han Dynasty produced some of China's greatest poetry and philosophy. The Maya post-classic period produced the synthesis of Chichen Itza and the far-flung trade networks that connected the Yucatan to the wider Mesoamerican world. The collapse is not only destruction, it is also, in a terrible and paradoxical sense, creation. But here we should pause and acknowledge a pattern within the pattern, a detail that becomes visible only when we line up these examples side by side and look at them with the cold eye of comparative analysis. In every case of successful recovery, there is a specific precondition that is easy to overlook because it seems so obvious. Someone must want to recover. Someone must believe that the broken civilization is worth rebuilding. This sounds trivial, but it is not. After a collapse, after famine, civil war, institutional failure, the death of the gods, the most natural response is not determination but despair. Why rebuild? Why go through the agony of reconstruction when the result will only be another cycle of growth, stagnation, and collapse? The dialogue of a man with his soul poses exactly this question, and the man, exhausted by the chaos of the intermediate period, cannot find a convincing answer. Mentuhotep could, Liu Bang could, the Maya, who built Chichen Itza on the ruins of the classic tradition, could, the Greeks who created the polis from the ashes of the Mycenaean world could, but the people of the Western Roman Empire, for the most part, could not. When Rome fell, the local populations did not launch a recovery movement. They adapted to the new Germanic rulers. They learned new languages, adopted new customs, intermarried with the newcomers, and gradually forgot what Rome had been. The dream of Roman restoration survived in the minds of a few, in the courts of Constantinople, in the papal court at Rome, in the imagination of Charlemagne. But it never commanded the broad popular support that would have been needed to make it real. The will to recover was absent, or rather, it was present only in the elite, not in the mass of the population that would have had to do the actual work of reconstruction. This suggests something important about the nature of civilizational identity. A civilization can survive the loss of its government, its monuments, and its institutions, but it cannot survive the loss of its self-belief. The moment a people stop thinking of themselves as a civilization, the moment they start thinking of themselves as simply individuals living in a post-civilizational landscape, the possibility of recovery vanishes. The building blocks may still exist, but no one is motivated to assemble them. Egypt never lost its self-belief. Even during the darkest years of the first intermediate period, the Egyptians continued to think of themselves as Egyptians, as members of a civilization that had a past, a present, and a future. The memory of the old kingdom was not a burden, it was a beacon, and Mentuhotep, when he launched his campaign of reunification, was not creating a new idea. He was activating an old one, an idea that had survived the collapse because the people who carried it refused to let it die. And now we arrive at the question that has been building since the beginning of this story. The question that surfaces at 3 in the morning and refuses to be dismissed. Not the question of whether civilizations collapse, we know they do. Not the question of whether they recover, we know they can. But the deeper question, the one that the story of Mentuhotep II poses with particular force, of what it costs not in gold or in stone, but in human terms, in lives, in meaning, in the things that cannot be measured or counted, but that make the difference between a civilization that is merely functioning and a civilization that is alive. Think about the 60 soldiers in the Tomb of the Warriors, young men, strong enough to march, brave enough to advance into arrow fire, loyal enough to die for a king's vision of a reunified country. We do not know their names. We do not know whether they had families waiting for them in Thebes, wives, children, parents who would never learn exactly where or how they fell. We do not know whether they believed in the cause they were fighting for, or were simply following orders, conscripted into a war they did not fully understand, as soldiers have been in every conflict since the beginning of organized violence. We know only that they died violently on a battlefield somewhere in Middle Egypt, and that their king honored them with a burial near his own eternal resting place. This is not mythology. This is not literary embellishment. This is what reunification looks like up close. Not the triumphal processions, not the crown ceremonies, not the temple dedications, the bodies, the arrow wounds, the skulls cracked by maces, the flesh torn by vultures because the burial parties arrived too late. Let that sink in. Every civilization that has pulled itself back from collapse has paid this price. Every reunification, every reconstruction, every renewal has been built on a foundation of sacrifice. Sometimes willing, sometimes forced, always costly. The Han Dynasty was founded on the bodies of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who died in the civil wars that followed the fall of the Qin. The reunification of China under the Sui Dynasty in the 6th century AD was achieved through military campaigns that devastated entire provinces and forced labor projects, including the Grand Canal that killed workers by the tens of thousands. The European recovery from the Dark Ages, if we can call it a recovery, was punctuated by centuries of warfare, plague, and the displacement of entire populations. The American Civil War, which preserved the United States as a unified nation, killed more than 600,000 people, a toll that, adjusted for population, would be equivalent to roughly 6 million deaths today. Reunification is not a gift. It is a purchase, and the currency is always the same. But the cost of reunification is not measured only in lives. It is measured in memory, in the things that are forgotten, deliberately or accidentally, in the process of building a new order. When Mentuhotep conquered the north, the Herakleopolitan dynasty was erased from history. Their monuments were neglected, their inscriptions defaced, their names removed from the king lists that Egyptian scribes maintained as the official record of royal succession. The perspective of the north, the experience of 100 years of Herakleopolitan rule, the achievements of their administrators, the hopes of their people, was suppressed in favor of a Theban narrative of liberation and reunification. This is not unique to Egypt. Every reunification involves an act of narrative violence, the imposition of a single story on a population that lived through multiple stories. The winners write the history, the losers become footnotes, and the complexity of the actual experience, the ambiguities, the moral compromises, the suffering on both sides, is flattened into a triumphalist narrative that serves the interests of the new order. Think about what this means in practice. A family in Middle Egypt that had served the Herakleopolitan court for 3 generations, that had prospered under northern rule, that had built tombs decorated with images of their northern king, that had sent their sons to serve in the northern army, woke up one morning to discover that everything they had known and valued had been declared illegitimate. Their king was gone, their court was dissolved, their officials were replaced by Thebans they had never met. The history they had lived through, the history of their own community, told from their own perspective, was being rewritten by the victors. They were expected to celebrate the reunification, to praise the Theban king, who had destroyed the only government they had ever known, and to pretend that the world they had lost had never really existed. This is the human reality of civilizational recovery, not the grand narrative of the historian, the lived experience of the people who had to accept, overnight, that everything they had known was over. The Egyptologist Jan Assmann, in his study of cultural memory in ancient Egypt, argued that the transition from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom represented a fundamental shift in the way Egyptians understood their own past. The Old Kingdom had been characterized by what Assmann called ritual memory, a form of collective remembrance that was embedded in the performance of religious ceremonies, in the maintenance of royal cults, and in the physical permanence of monumental architecture. The pyramids were not just tombs, they were memory devices, structures designed to ensure that the king and the civilization he represented would be remembered forever. But the collapse of the Old Kingdom shattered this form of memory. The royal cults were abandoned, the pyramids were robbed, the rituals were interrupted, and in their place arose a new form of memory, what Assmann called cultural memory, that was embedded not in institutions and monuments, but in texts. The wisdom literature of the Middle Kingdom, the instructions, the dialogues, the tales, the laments, preserved the lessons of the past in a form that was portable, reproducible, and independent of any particular institution or monument. The Egyptians learned through the trauma of collapse that monuments can be destroyed and institutions can fail, but stories survive, knowledge survives, the written word survives. And it is through the written word, through the texts that the Middle Kingdom scribes produced, copied, and transmitted across generations, that the memory of what Egypt had been, and what it had lost, and what it had rebuilt, was preserved across the millennia. This transition from ritual memory to cultural memory is one of the most important intellectual developments in the history of human civilization. It is the moment when a society learns that its identity does not depend on any particular set of physical structures or political institutions, that identity can be carried in stories, in texts, in the shared understanding of what the civilization means and why it matters. The Jews would make this discovery centuries later when the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem forced them to transfer their identity from a physical place to a portable text, the Torah, that could be carried into exile and preserved across millennia of displacement. The Greeks made a similar discovery during the Dark Ages, when the memory of the Mycenaean past was preserved not in monuments but in oral poetry, in the stories of gods and heroes that would eventually be written down as the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Chinese made it during the centuries of division after the Han, when Confucian texts became the thread of continuity that connected one unified dynasty to the next across centuries of fragmentation. In every case, the transition from monument to text, from architecture to narrative, is the moment when a civilization learns how to survive its own death. It is the moment when the civilization becomes, in a sense, immortal, because stories are harder to kill than buildings, and ideas are harder to burn than temples. There is a particular kind of grief that accompanies the study of civilizational recovery, a grief that is different from the grief of collapse. The grief of collapse is the grief of loss, the sadness of watching a great civilization die, of seeing its monuments crumble, its libraries burn, its people scatter. The grief of recovery is subtler, and in some ways more painful. It is the grief of cost, the sadness of understanding what the recovery demanded, what was sacrificed, what was erased, what was distorted in the process of putting the pieces back together. Mentuhotep's Egypt was a magnificent achievement. The Middle Kingdom produced some of the finest literature, the most elegant art, and the most sophisticated governance in the ancient world. But it was built on the bones of 60 soldiers, whose names we will never know, on the erasure of a northern dynasty whose perspective was silenced, on the suppression of local identities that had flourished during the intermediate period, and on the imposition of a Theban narrative that, for all its grandeur, could not fully contain the complexity of what Egypt had actually experienced. The archaeologist who excavates a mass grave does not celebrate the victory that the grave represents. She mourns the lives that were spent to achieve it, and this is the proper response. Not because the victory was not worth achieving, but because the cost of achieving it deserves to be acknowledged, honored, and remembered. The 60 soldiers in the Tomb of the Warriors are not footnotes in the story of reunification. They are the story. Without them, without their willingness to march into arrow fire for a king's vision of a unified country, there is no Middle Kingdom, there is no terraced temple at Deir el-Bahari, there is no golden age of Egyptian literature. There is only the continued fragmentation, the continued decline, the slow fading of a civilization that could not find the will or the means to put itself back together. This is the paradox of civilizational recovery. The healing requires violence, the construction requires destruction, and the act of making something new requires the erasure, partial or complete, of what came before. Mentuhotep could not build a unified Egypt while also preserving the independence of the Herakleopolitan North. He could not create a new national narrative while also honoring the competing narratives of every region that had developed its own identity during the fragmentation. He could not reform the administration without displacing the officials who had run the old system. Every act of creation was also an act of elimination, and the people who were eliminated, the northern officials who lost their positions, the nomarchs who lost their autonomy, the soldiers who lost their lives, paid the price for a future they would never see. We live in a time when the possibility of civilizational disruption is discussed with increasing frequency and increasing anxiety in academic journals, in policy papers, in the conversations that people have late at night when the masks of optimism come off. Climate change, pandemic disease, nuclear proliferation, the fragility of global supply chains, the erosion of trust in institutions, the rise of technologies that concentrate power in fewer and fewer hands. The list of vulnerabilities is long, and it grows longer with each passing year. The story of Mentuhotep II does not tell us how to avoid these threats. No historical example can. But it tells us something equally important. It tells us what happens after. What happens when the worst-case scenario arrives and the civilization that seemed permanent turns out to be as fragile as every other civilization in human history. And here is the thought that will not leave. The thought that makes the story of Mentuhotep II so relevant to anyone listening at this hour. We assume that recovery is a return to normal, that after the crisis passes, things go back to the way they were. The archaeological record tells a different story. Recovery is not a return, it is a transformation. The civilization that emerges from collapse is never the same as the one that fell. It carries the scars of the catastrophe. in its institutions, in its art, in its literature, in its fundamental understanding of what is possible and what is fragile. The Middle Kingdom was not the Old Kingdom restored. It was the Old Kingdom's heir, haunted by the memory of failure, shaped by the determination not to repeat it, marked forever by the knowledge that even the greatest civilization can die. And perhaps that is the gift hidden inside the grief. The knowledge of fragility is also the knowledge of preciousness. The Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom knew, in a way that the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom never could, that their civilization was not permanent. They knew it could be lost. They had seen it lost. They had lived through the losing, or rather, their grandparents had, and the memory of that losing was still fresh enough to shape policy, to inform theology, to colour every inscription and every architectural choice with the awareness that nothing is guaranteed. And that knowledge made them, in some ways, better stewards of what they had rebuilt. They wrote more carefully, recording not just the triumphs of kings, but the challenges of governance, the dangers of complacency, the subtle signs of institutional decay. They governed more attentively, creating systems of oversight, establishing new administrative procedures, building redundancy into the bureaucratic apparatus so that the failure of any single component would not bring the whole system crashing down. They built more flexibly, not the rigid geometric perfection of the pyramids, but the organic landscape-integrated architecture of the terrace temple. They created a civilization that was, in many respects, more humane, more reflective, and more resilient than the one that had come before. The Middle Kingdom's literary tradition, considered by later Egyptians to be the golden age of their language, is suffused with this awareness of fragility. The tale of the eloquent peasant tells the story of a man who is wronged by a corrupt official and who must argue his case through 9 increasingly desperate petitions to a magistrate who seems indifferent to justice. The story is simultaneously a masterwork of rhetoric and a meditation on the vulnerability of the powerless before the powerful, a theme that would have been unthinkable in the self-assured literature of the Old Kingdom. The Instruction of Amenemhat, in which a dead king warns his son about the treachery of those closest to power, is a text that could only have been written by a civilization that had learned, through direct experience, that power is precarious and that the people you trust most may be the ones who destroy you. These are not the texts of a confident civilization at its peak. They are the texts of a civilization that has been through the fire and emerged scarred but wise. A civilization that has traded the innocence of the Old Kingdom for the hard-won knowledge of the Middle Kingdom. The collapse did not just destroy, it also taught, and the lesson it taught, that permanence is an illusion, that systems must adapt or die, that the human beings at the center of every civilization are both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability, is a lesson that has not yet been fully learned by any civilization that come since. We have followed the story of Mentuhotep II from the mass grave at the base of the cliffs to the terraced temple above it, from the bodies of the fallen to the monuments of the victorious. We have seen how a civilization can break and how it can be rebuilt. We have seen the cost of that rebuilding, measured in lives, in memory, in the suppression of inconvenient truths and the imposition of necessary fictions. And we have seen, in the comparative evidence from China, from Rome, from Greece, from the Maya, that Egypt's pattern is not exceptional, it is universal. The specific details change, the geography, the gods, the weapons, the names of the kings, but the underlying dynamics remain the same across millennia and across continents. So what does this mean for us? It means, first, that the collapse of a civilization is not the end of history. It is a phase, a devastating, traumatic, immensely costly phase, but a phase nonetheless. The archaeological record shows with overwhelming clarity that human beings have the capacity to recover from civilizational collapse. Not always, not everywhere, not without terrible sacrifice, but the capacity is there. Egypt recovered, China recovered, Greece recovered, in a form so different from the original that it produced an entirely new kind of civilization. The human species has been through this cycle before, many times, and it has survived every time. This is not grounds for complacency. The Roman West is a permanent reminder that recovery is not guaranteed, but it is grounds for a cautious, clear-eyed hope, the hope that even if the worst happens, the human capacity to rebuild is real and has been demonstrated repeatedly across the full span of recorded history. But the record also shows that recovery is never free. It always costs more than anyone expects. It always takes longer than anyone hopes. And it always produces a civilization that is different from the one that fell. Shaped by the memory of catastrophe, marked by the compromises that reconstruction demanded, haunted by the awareness that what was rebuilt can be broken again. The Middle Kingdom was not the Old Kingdom. The Han Dynasty was not the Qin. Classical Greece was not Mycenaean Greece. Recovery is transformation, not restoration, and the sooner a civilization accepts that, the sooner it stops trying to recreate the past and starts building something adapted to the present, the better its chances of survival. Mentuhotep II understood this, whether intuitively or by deliberate calculation. His mortuary temple at Deir el-Bakkari was not a pyramid, it was something new. A building that used the natural landscape rather than dominating it, that incorporated the tombs of his soldiers alongside the shrines of his queens, that declared through its architecture that the new Egypt would be different from the old. His administrative reforms did not simply replicate the Old Kingdom bureaucracy. They created new structures, appointed new kinds of officials, established new lines of authority that were designed to prevent the accumulation of hereditary power that had destroyed his predecessors. His theology did not simply reassert the old claims of divine kingship, it revised them, creating a model of leadership that was accountable, achievement-based, and aware of its own limitations in ways that the Old Kingdom model had never been. Every decision reflected the same principle: honor the past, but do not repeat it. The question is whether we are capable of the same kind of creative response, whether, when the crises of our own time intensify, as the archaeological record suggests we will have the wisdom to build something new rather than clinging to something old, whether we will find our own version of what Mentuhotep found, a way to honor the past while accepting that the future must be different, whether we will be willing to pay the cost of reconstruction, knowing that it will be higher than we imagine and that the result will not be what we expected. There is a temptation, when studying the collapse and recovery of ancient civilizations, to draw facile lessons for the present, to treat the past as a mirror held up to our own time, reflecting our anxieties back at us in conveniently historical form. We should resist that temptation. Mentuhotep's Egypt was not our world. The challenges he faced, the specific dynamics of the Nile Valley, the theological framework of divine kingship, the technology of bronze and stone, the relatively small population and limited territory are not our challenges. But the deeper patterns, the vulnerability of complex systems to cascading failure, the difficulty of rebuilding trust after institutional breakdown, the tension between the desire for stability and the necessity of adaptation, the cost of recovery in human lives and human meaning, these patterns are universal. They apply to every civilization, in every era, including our own. Consider the structural parallels. Our civilization, like the Old Kingdom, has grown increasingly complex over centuries, layering institution upon institution, system upon system, dependency upon dependency, until the whole structure has achieved a level of intricacy that no single person can fully comprehend. This complexity is the source of our power. It enables us to feed 8 billion people, to communicate instantaneously across continents, to treat diseases that were death sentences a century ago. But it is also the source of our vulnerability, because every added layer of complexity is also an added point of failure. Every new dependency is a new way for a disruption in one part of the system to cascade into disruptions everywhere else. The Old Kingdom fell, in part because its complexity had exceeded its capacity for management, because the system had grown too intricate for any single center of authority to maintain. The same dynamic is visible in every civilizational collapse that we have examined in this survey, and the same dynamic is visible, if we are willing to look, in the civilization we inhabit today. The ruins of Mentuhotep's temple still stand at Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor. They are modest compared to the temple of Hatshepsut, that was built next to them 500 years later. A building that borrowed Mentuhotep's terrace design and amplified it to spectacular effect. Most tourists who visit the Theban necropolis walk past Mentuhotep's ruins on their way to Hatshepsut's temple, barely glancing at the low walls and scattered columns that are all that remain of the building that started it all. The tour guides sometimes mention it in passing. This was built by Mentuhotep II, who reunified Egypt, before moving on to the more photogenic monument next door. The archaeologists know what those ruins represent. They represent the moment when a broken civilization decided to live again. The moment when a king from the south looked at the wreckage of the old kingdom, the famine, the civil war, the shattered theology, the failed institutions, the fragmented countryside, and decided that it could be fixed. Not restored, fixed, made into something new. That decision, the decision to rebuild rather than to surrender, is the most important decision any civilization can make. It is the decision that separates the civilizations that survive from the ones that do not. And it is a decision that cannot be made once and then forgotten. It must be made again and again, in every generation, by every society that wants to endure. The Nile will always fluctuate. The climate will always change. The institutions will always calcify. The elites will always accumulate power at the expense of the common good. The center will always be tempted to ignore the periphery. These are not ancient problems. They are permanent problems, problems that belong to every civilization, in every era, on every continent, and the only defense against them is awareness. The awareness that collapse is possible, the awareness that recovery is costly, and the awareness that the civilization we live inside is not a given, it is an achievement, maintained by effort, threatened by complacency, and preserved only by the willingness to confront the truth about what we are and what we might become. It is late now. The cliffs at Deir el-Bahari are silver in the moonlight. The Nile flows below, as it has flowed for millennia, indifferent to the kingdoms that have risen and fallen along its banks, indifferent to the pharaohs who claimed to control its waters, and the priests who claimed to predict its moods. Somewhere beneath the sand and the rubble, at the base of the cliffs, the bones of 60 soldiers rest in the tomb that Herbert Winlock opened a century ago, and that the Egyptian government has since sealed to protect from further deterioration. They are still there, still wrapped in their brown linen, still bearing the wounds that killed them 4,000 years ago. They do not know that the war they died in was successful. They do not know that the king they served reunified the country they fought for. They do not know that the civilization they helped to save would flourish for another 2,000 years, producing temples and tombs and texts that would one day be studied by people from countries that did not exist when they were alive. They do not know that a young American archaeologist, working at the base of a cliff 3,900 years after their deaths, would unwrap their linen, study their wounds, and weep at what he found. They know nothing. They are bones in the dark, and yet they speak, not in words but in the irrefutable language of evidence. They speak of loyalty, of sacrifice, of the terrible cost that civilizations pay for the privilege of continuing to exist. But we know what they did, we know what it cost. We know that the civilization they helped to rebuild, the Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt, was one of the most remarkable achievements of the ancient world, a civilization that produced the Tale of Sinuhe, one of the great adventure stories of world literature, the story of an exile who fled Egypt after the assassination of a pharaoh and who spent years wandering in the Levant before returning home to die in the land he loved, a civilization that built the fortress of Buhan in Nubia, one of the most impressive military installations of the Bronze Age, a structure with walls 10 meters high, with bastions and firing platforms and a moat, designed to protect Egypt's southern border with a sophistication that Roman military engineers would have respected. A civilization that created a model of governance so effective that it was studied and imitated by every subsequent dynasty in Egyptian history. A model that balanced central authority with provincial administration, that valued bureaucratic competence over hereditary privilege, and that understood, as no previous Egyptian government had, that the state must serve the people or the people will abandon the state. a civilization that learned through the agony of collapse and the labor of reconstruction that permanence is not a birthright, it is a choice, a daily, difficult, never-finished choice that must be made again and again, in the face of every drought, every political crisis, every moment of institutional failure, every temptation to let the system run on autopilot while the cracks deepen beneath the surface. A civilization that understood, because it had learned the lesson in the hardest possible way, that the work of maintaining a state is never complete, that the forces of fragmentation are always present, always waiting, always patient, and that the only thing worse than the cost of fighting those forces is the cost of surrendering to them. We began this story with a question. How does a civilization come back from the dead? The answer, according to the evidence of Mentuhotep II and every other leader who has faced the same challenge, is this: painfully, imperfectly, at a cost that can never be fully tallied, with compromises that cannot be fully justified, through the sacrifice of people whose names will never be recorded and whose stories will never be told, and with the knowledge, the hard, uncomfortable, essential knowledge, that the rebuilt civilization is not the old one restored. It is something new, something shaped by loss, something that carries the memory of failure, like a scar that never fully heals but that serves, for those who are willing to look at it, as a permanent reminder of what happens when a civilization takes its own survival for granted. Remember the 60 soldiers. Remember that civilizations do not heal themselves. People heal them, with their labor, with their loyalty, with their lives. Remember that the temple above the tomb was built by the same hands that dug the grave. Remember that the cost of renewal is always paid by those who can least afford it: the soldiers, the laborers, the farmers conscripted into armies, the families left behind, the communities displaced by the upheaval of reconstruction. And remember that the civilization you live inside, this vast, intricate, magnificent, fragile system of systems that provides you with food, shelter, knowledge, connection, and 1,000 daily miracles you no longer notice because they have become routine, was not inevitable. It was built. It is maintained by the labor of millions of people whose names you will never know and whose contributions you will never see. And it can, if we are not careful, be lost. Not in a single dramatic catastrophe, that is the Hollywood version, but in the slow accumulation of neglect, of institutional decay, of the quiet decision, made 1,000 times by 1,000 people, to let someone else worry about the cracks in the foundation. Mentuhotep II knew this. He knew it because he had seen the alternative. The ruins of the old kingdom, the famine graves, the silent temples, the abandoned quarries, the shattered administrative records scattered in the dust. He had seen what happens when a civilization stops maintaining itself, and he had spent 51 years of his life, from the first tentative campaigns of his youth to the massive quarrying expeditions of his old age, doing the work of repair, not because it was easy, not because it was glorious, not because anyone thanked him for it, but because it needed to be done, because the alternative was the darkness, and because someone had to decide that the darkness was not acceptable. The Nile flows on. The stars above Thebes are the same stars that Mentuhotep saw when he stood on the terrace of his temple and looked out over the kingdom he had reassembled from the ruins of the old. He had done what no one alive believed was possible. He had made the heart of the two lands live again, but he knew, because the bones beneath his feet reminded him every day, that the heart could stop, that it had stopped before, and that the only thing standing between the living kingdom and the silence of the ruins was the willingness of each generation to do the work of keeping it alive. 4,000 years later, the work continues. It has never stopped. It will never stop. It is the oldest work in the world, older than the pyramids, older than writing, older than the cities that first made civilization possible. It is the work of maintenance, of vigilance, of repair, of the daily, unglamorous, essential choice to keep going when the easier path is to let it all fall apart. It is the work that Mentuhotep began, and that every generation since has been required to continue. That is the story of Mentuhotep II. That is the story of every civilization that has ever clawed its way back from the edge of oblivion. And that, if we are honest with ourselves, is the story we are living in right now.